I'm Ossie Davis. One of the things I care most deeply about, and I certainly hope that you do too, is about what is going on in South Africa. And one of the best ways to keep informed is to watch the program, South Africa Now.
Global Vision presents the television news magazine of Southern Africa.
It doesn't exist on television, and it doesn't exist.
I would actually appeal to the world that information is there and can be found.
Because it is important that people know what is happening.
This week, South Africa Now reports these stories. As the hunger strike spreads inside South Africa, an illegal demonstration in Johannesburg opposes detention without trial.
We're forced to listen while we are not informed. We're not allowed to know how many people actually are in detention. We may not express our outrage, disgust and distress in public protest at meetings.
A follow-up on Winnie Mandela and a critique of how the story has been played.
Any network executive who says, see, we're covering South Africa and points to that story, you know, you should just laugh in his face.
And the music of Abdullah Ibrahim, a preview of the home video, A Brother with Perfect Timing. All of these stories and more on South Africa Now with Fana, Kekana and Mweli Mzizi.
Realoja. Political detainees are being released in South Africa as the hunger strike against detention without trial spreads. For the first time, opposition groups have forced the Minister of Law and Order to address the issue. He has promised to release, quote, a substantial number of detainees. For a look at what's happening inside South Africa, we have this report.
Information we're getting from South Africa is confused. We have reports that only 68 detainees have been released in connection with the hunger strike. And this is out of a population of about 2,000. The reason that the information is unclear is that the government controls the information so strictly. People don't know where hunger strikes have been called off or where they have just been suspended. In some cases, the hunger strikes continue and actually grow, and it's in all likelihood these hunger strikes will continue until the detainees issue is completely resolved.
These are two of the hunger strikers living at Johannesburg Hospital. They have been forbidden to talk to the press.
We are very sorry. I can't comment because I've been severely restricted.
Their lawyer explained their status.
In terms of their orders, they basically may not participate in the activities of several organizations. They cannot give press interviews. In Mr. Masondo's case, his livelihood is going to be affected because he won't be able to resume his trade union activities.
Francis Mutsisi's son has been released, but he's disappointed.
Let me put it this way. When he came out, I was excited. I was very excited. Until I saw his restriction orders. It was only then that I realized that he's still in jail.
Reporters were allowed on hospital grounds to meet some of the detainees who ended their hunger strike. They say they will resume if they are not released.
This hunger strike, it has not been stopped. It has been suspended.
Church leader Frank Chikane visited the men and told them of his meeting with Adriaan Vlok, the Minister of Law and Order.
We made it quite clear to the minister that, we're dealing with 4 stages here. It's the hunger strike detainees, the detainees in general, the state of emergency, and the apartheid system. That if you don't deal with the apartheid system, you might be forced to re-detain the people again. Because the real issue, it's not the people, it is the system that makes them to take a stand against it.
This is Adriaan Vlok, South Africa's Minister of Law and Order. We called his office in Cape Town and spoke with his press secretary, Leon Mellet.
We are prepared to look at complaints and to look at reasons and to consider, all the time, to consider reasons and requests and aspects involving detentions of these people and involving the continued detention. If it's not absolutely necessary to detain a person, then certainly he must be released.
But in spite of government assurances, only a small number of detainees have been released. Still, newspaper editor Gabu Tagwana says the strike has had an effect.
yes, it has achieved, I think, quite a lot, because it was able to put people who have been inactive all the time during the state of emergency for the last 2 years into action, and that has really undermined the state of emergency.
Anti-apartheid activists rallied behind the hunger strikers with a flurry of protests and press conferences.
Yes, I do expect many detainees to be released soon.
Not only in Diepkloof, but around the country.
Yes.
At Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg, there was a sympathy fest by student leaders and a statement by writer Nadine Gordimer.
We're forced to listen while we are not informed. We're not allowed to know how many people actually are in detention. We may not express our outrage, disgust and distress in public protest at meetings. Even the lawyers themselves, with the authority of their professional prestige as part of the legal system, have been denied this right.
Coverage of the hunger strike was dwarfed by the front-page treatment of the Winnie Mandela affair. Another killing in Soweto was linked to the now-dissolved Mandela Football Club, the so-called bodyguards whom Mrs. Mandela had defended. Mrs. Mandela has denied any wrongdoing. For some background, we turn to Tom Lodge, who was one of Mrs. Mandela's teachers at Wits University in Johannesburg.
I'm sure that political activists inside South Africa are anxious for some form of reconciliation. Statements by UDF leaders have on the whole been fairly restrained, and they've tried to avoid conscientiously any note of personal acrimony. Whether such reconciliation can be attained, though, will very much depend on Mrs. Mandela's success in putting a distance between her and the activities of her bodyguards. I think there's a general realization amongst those people who are familiar with the issues that Mrs. Mandela may well not have been in control of the circumstances that led to the death of the youths allegedly killed by her bodyguards. But, as I say, it's going to be a question of distance, and it may not be easy for Mrs. Mandela to create that distance because there are many people who are hostile to her and hostile to the movement of which she is part, who are anxious to exploit the conflicts and contradictions that may arise over the issues of this scandal.
In South Africa, opinions are divided on Winnie Mandela's possible involvement in the death of a young student activist, Stompie Moeketsi. There was anti-Winnie graffiti on walls and a range of reactions in the streets.
I don't believe a woman like her can kill children. She's a mother, she bears children as well. I don't think she can kill a black child.
I think she lost her dignity. I think really what she did, if it's true, it's really embarrassing.
She should be in jail.
And as far as I'm concerned, I'm saying she still is regarded as the mother of nation until she's proved guilty, and that's all.
There were calls for unity when Stompie Moeketsi was buried, a theme echoed by church leader Frank Chikane.
We have appealed to the community, to exercise restraint and calm and act responsibly. And I don't expect anybody to go about attacking another person.
TV coverage has also been an issue, especially the South African government's willingness to make available worldwide this footage of the police raid on Mrs. Mandela's home while restricting most other coverage of police activity. South African broadcasting used their coverage to score propaganda points against the African National Congress.
The main question that has been raised by the actions of the so-called Mother of the Nation and her band of bodyguards is just what sort of government will the ANC be if ever it takes control of South Africa.
Recent happenings in South Africa have shown that the organization is in fact a terrorist organization, and what hope would human rights in South Africa have if these type of people ever ruled South Africa?
In the U.S., former CBS producer Richard Cohen commented on the coverage on a New York public television program, The 11th Hour.
Here's a little slice of a huge story, and we can understand it, and somebody famous is involved, and the police are going to help us on this one. So sure, I mean, I don't ascribe terrible motives to the networks, but I just don't think that any network executive who says, "See, we're covering South Africa," and points to that story, you should just laugh in his face. I mean, the fact is that there's a great deal that's going on in South Africa today in the homelands, in the townships, in the labor unions, on the university campuses, in the political organizations. There's a whole fabric of activity and opportunity for journalists, and nobody's touching the story.
In Namibia, church sources report 4 people were killed by US and South African-backed Angolan rebels. But church leaders also say there has been a sharp drop in South African army attacks against civilians. The South Africans seem to be turning from violence and intimidation to a propaganda campaign against the Namibian Liberation Movement, SWAPO. We spoke with Vazera Kandetu of the Namibian Council of Churches.
The security forces are indeed engaged in political activities. We don't know exactly for which parties, but indeed they are, in the form of showing films that they have prepared around in the country, where they depict the current situation as the ideal situation for everybody who's getting ready to vote. And they would show the picture of some country, some place where people are starving and this kind of thing. And they'll say, as you see, this is the situation as we have it. This is the situation as we will have it after independence, if SWAPO takes over.
Meanwhile, reports indicate that the De Beers Mining Corporation has already held meetings with SWAPO, which is likely to form the next government. SWAPO's biggest challenge is to find ways to redistribute some of the colony's extensive wealth. SWAPO President Sam Nujoma.
All this wealth are today exclusively in the hands of the minority white settlers, whereas the black people, the owner of the land, are suffering from hunger, disease, and ignorance. You find in Namibia today, even when you go to the capital, children with the big tummy suffering from malnutrition, whereas the white children are well looked after and they are not hungry.
You are watching South Africa Now, the television news magazine that goes behind the headlines.
Pretoria spends an estimated $20 million in its lobbying and propaganda activities. This is a subject we've been investigating. Unfortunately, South African lobbyists have refused to speak with South Africa Now. But here is what Eric Nedler has learned without their help.
Lunches at fancy restaurants. Hard to get football tickets.
The South African government's goal is a constitutional
Video
democracy.
propaganda.
All South Africans share political
These are the tools of the lobbying trade, used by South Africa's operatives in the United States.
The Justice Department in Washington, D.C. It is here that all lobbyists for foreign governments must register and report. South Africa Now has analyzed documents filed by a well-paid army of agents working on behalf of the South African government. In this report, we'll tell you who they are and what they do.
Ronald Reagan spoke out against sanctions.
Would not only be disruptive to surrounding states that are virtually linked to South Africa's economy.
This man, John Sears, was Reagan's campaign manager in 1980. He is Pretoria's highest paid lobbyist at $500,000 a year. President George Bush, who supports his predecessor's policy of constructive engagement with South Africa. His former press secretary and close personal friend Peter Thiele was a registered lobbyist for the International Gold Corporation of South Africa. Vice President Dan Quayle, who has opposed trade sanctions against Pretoria. This is Stuart Spencer, a key campaign aide to the Vice President and a former registered agent for the South African Republic. This information is contained in these filings, which reveal that South Africa, like many foreign countries, employs a network of high-priced consultants in the United States. But these specialists have a difficult job, selling a government which routinely violates the human rights of most of its citizens. Their first objective, influencing the government. Dean Sanford Unger of American University in Washington, D.C.
I think the South Africans have become a lot more subtle about what they're doing over the years. They've always been very clever. They always have Democrats and Republicans working for them, both sides of the street, as it were. They also have now not only white people but black people working for them, American blacks lobbying on their behalf. And I think they have managed to learn pretty well how to work the Capitol Hill and the executive branch of this government.
While anti-apartheid demonstrators make noise outside the Capitol, Inside, the South African lobbyists patrol the corridors of power. The documents reveal they have gained easy access to the highest levels of American policymaking, from senators to the Secretary of Defense. They push their client's case on issues crucial to Pretoria. In Washington, the South African lobby coordinates a sophisticated intelligence operation against the anti-apartheid movement.
They follow right behind us with meetings, with contacts by the South African ambassador, with written information on the issue that we have contacted the lawmaker on. So I think they're very much tracking our work. They are trying very hard to undermine our work.
Indeed, this document reveals that there apparently was political intelligence work done. This firm obtained and provided information on the activities of Trans-Africa, civil rights leader Joseph Lowry, and the Bishop Tutu Refugee Fund. While keeping tabs on opponents, the lobby works closely with friends, like North Carolina's Senator Jesse Helms, who traveled to South Africa with a delegation embraced by Pretoria. These candid pictures of the senator in South Africa were provided to us by a North Carolina newspaper publisher who went along. His stories echoed the government's most recent line.
The South Africans take a spare-no-expense approach in their public relations campaign. Here at the world-famous 21 Club, they entertain politicians and the nation's leading reporters.
Another prime objective, manipulating the media. Journalists from influential publications broke bread with South African officials at lunches set up by the man on the right, Tom Bolin, law partner of the late Roy Cohn, the assistant to Senator Joseph McCarthy. Here at the New York Post, Bolin arranged a closed-door lunch for the South African ambassador and the newspaper's editorial board, which had been critical of economic sanctions against Pretoria. Bolin also arranged meetings with William Buckley Jr., another critic. Incidentally, he's taking his firing line special to South Africa this spring. Not content with merely influencing coverage, the South Africans secretly tried to purchase American newspapers. Alistair Sparks, a leading South African journalist, covered the scandal.
Well, in Washington, they used a front man here, John McGough, who owned the Panax newspaper chain, and they gave him $10 million to buy the Washington Star. He made his bid. He was outbid by Time, and so he didn't get the Star. He then swanned off to Sacramento, and he bought the Sacramento Union.
McGough was charged with failing to register as a South African agent, but Attorney General Ed Meese let the charges die. McGough popped up back in the news recently as a fat cat donor to the Republican Party.
I don't know that in our investigations we ever got to the bottom of it all. We certainly dredged up a lot of it, but there was an enormous cover-up operation, and I think that a lot of those projects continued. And I think there may well be one or more newspapers in the United States that are still part-owned at least, or assisted financially in some way in this country.
Another objective, cultivating American blacks. Pretoria paid William Keyes almost $400,000 a year to tell black audiences about a changing South Africa. Roy Innes took a trip to South Africa paid for by a South African business lobby. The former civil rights leader was romanced by officials of the government.
I think these fellows pretty much accepted the position that the thing has to change and will change. I was surprised, really, how reasonable sounding these officials of government were.
Reasonable. That's also the line this man heard when he was lobbied.
This was the experience that I had during my trip to South Africa with all of the white South Africans that I encountered. When they found out that I was American, it was almost as that they all felt a sense of obligation to show me how reasonable they were.
And that's the pitch the South African lobby is making to Americans today.
But again, it's not new. It's just a little more subtle and perhaps a little more extensive than it used to be.
Abdullah Ibrahim, one of South Africa's leading jazz musicians, has been exiled from his homeland since 1976. Also known as Dollar Brand, he lives in New York City and performs worldwide. This week's culture segment features excerpts from a new film, A Brother with Perfect Timing, directed by Chris Austin. The film is now available from Rhapsody Home Video.
Said, what is the song about? And of course, we were recording in Cape Town. And our first thought was Marienburg, because it was the sound of the mood of the people at that time, right? Now, several things became involved, or like all our lives crystallized in this the song, you see, because a few months later, when the album was released, Soweto Uprising. Timing. Do get perfect timing. Timing is arriving at the right point at the right time with a minimum amount of effort. In Marienburg, right? Basil, Basil could see the tenor player, saxophone player, related us the story. And told us the story. And so you imagine a Saturday morning in township, right? I mean, you've never seen so many children anywhere in your life than a Saturday morning in the township. Children, people going shopping, cats, dogs, chickens, right? So here these two guys ambling down the road, right? Having a little taste. And these brothers have perfect timing. Moment of perfect timing crystallizes, and everybody focuses in on this moment, right? Without losing a beat, he just scoops the girl up and puts her down on this side and takes the joint from the other side and back in the pocket. There you go. Perfect timing. The master musicians. Someday soon, sweet summer, when all this period of all this exploitation and dark ages, living in dark, because there's no knowledge. Because they've been effectively trying to keep to suppress this knowledge. In time for the new nation has come.
Thank you for watching South Africa Now. Transcripts are available for $3. Make sure you ask for show 204. If you'd like a free resource list or to share your comments, send a stamped self-addressed envelope to South Africa Now, the Africa Fund, 198 Broadway, New York, New York, 10038. South Africa Now is produced on a non-profit basis by Global Vision in association with the Africa Fund.